So let me introduce our speaker, who is Nate Eversole. I think I'm saying that right. Is that right, Nate
That's
Eversole?
right.
Who is a language data researcher for Amazon Alexa. So you know that little thing that's in your house. This is one of the team members involved in that. Nate graduated from UT Arlington, from University of Texas at Arlington, with a bachelor's degree in Spanish back in 2011. And then he went on and received a PhD in linguistics, also at UT Arlington in 2017. And in that, he focused on human sentence processing, which makes sense why he's working on Alexa. And he also taught some undergraduate linguistics courses there while he was finishing up, as most of us do. Nate began working with Alexa at Amazon in like early 2018. And in his current role, he uses a variety of tools and methods to provide linguistic insights into Alexa's design and development, trying to make sure that its features are grounded in an understanding of actual human language, right? So this is that really cutting edge new stuff on this sort of, you know, uh, uh, artificial intelligence mimicking human language. So, very interesting stuff. Super excited to hear what Nate can tell us. Kristen, do you have anything to add or any anecdotes about Nate from grad school?
I have a lot of anecdotes, but I think I'll leave those for now.
Awesome. All right. Well, Nate, take it away. Go ahead and share your screen or whatever you need to do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the introduction. I'll say just a couple things and then start sharing my screen. Yeah, so I've been here at Alexa for 3 years, basically almost on the dot. I started in February of 2018, and so I've been here since pretty close after I graduated. I graduated with a PhD in 2017 in the summertime, and so basically the gap between that and February is when I was looking for work. So yeah, today I just wanted to talk a little bit about, let's see if I can figure this out correctly. All right, so hopefully you guys can see my screen.
Yep.
And yeah, I didn't really know what the title of the talk, but I said linguistics and tech, right? As Daniel was saying, I'm what's called a language data researcher, which I guess if you actually literally interpret that title, that is what I do. I do data research on language data. So that is a very literal title for what my role is. But I'll talk a little bit about kind of how I got here. Probably the meat of the talk will be what I do in generally speaking. And then kind of focus on maybe some of the skills that I use and things that people might be interested in learning ahead of time if you're interested in language technology, specifically from a linguistics perspective. And then hopefully I'll try and keep it not too long so that way we have a fair amount of time for questions. Oh, got to click into it. All right, here we go. So first, just to provide some history, like Daniel was saying, I got my PhD in linguistics, and I studied what's called psycholinguistics, focusing on human sentence processing. So what that basically means is if you've ever participated in a study for any sort of course credit in psychology, oftentimes that's the case, or sometimes maybe in linguistics, where you go in and someone basically asked you to do something for them. I had people come in and read sentences using an eye tracker, and I assessed their reading patterns to make judgments about how they're processing subject-verb agreement. And so that was what the dissertation research was on, and kind of did most of my focus work there. But generally speaking, I got training in a lot of different areas within theoretical linguistics, so semantics, syntax, phonology, that kind of stuff, as well as experimental linguistics. So those were the areas that I studied. Methods is actually something that I think it's worthwhile mentioning because while I spent most of my time in experimental methods, we also did courses in field methods, which is where you like go out and talk to somebody from a different language and write what they're saying down, and the goal is to kind of understand how the language works. And then corpus linguistics, where you're using big data sets and kind of querying within those big data sets to understand patterns of language and make theoretical inferences from that. And I'm betting Dr. Fleckenstein has talked about that, because I know some of her research dealt with corpus linguistics as well. And I think probably a lot of socio work in general does. I think these days there's a lot of corpus strategies involved in that. Yeah, so it's a very useful methodology. And I'll come back to that as well, but I wanted to bring those up because the methods that I studied actually became very useful in the work that I do. So how did I get started in the industry? Well, I began at Alexa in 2018. And unlike probably a lot of people, all I did was apply on Indeed.com, literally. So this is kind of a unique path maybe to linguistics or Alexa, in that I was actually originally looking for academic work, and basically eventually was having trouble finding it. But I also knew there was many linguistics jobs in industry. So I started applying for several of those, and was looking at kind of translation related projects and providing linguistic analysis for translation companies. But then I saw this position working on Amazon Alexa. And to be completely honest, never thought I would have any sort of chance at meeting the requirements for it. So, but I still spent the time to fill out the application and sent that in. So I say all that to say that for those of you who are, looking at pursuing different careers, even if it doesn't maybe look like, if it's a job you want, but you may not meet the requirements exactly, that shouldn't stop you from applying, because it usually often doesn't cost anything to do that. And then, yeah, then the interview cycle is a whole nother discussion that we could have, and I won't spend too much time on it. But interviewing for Amazon is a little bit of a unique experience, because they have a series of, I did a couple phone screens where they kind of screen you initially, but there's a series of 5-ish interviews that you go through on a day, in which they assess your skills, within whatever industry you're working in. And so for me, that is linguistics and data analysis skills. But there's also a focus on kind of more behavioral things. So if you've heard of Amazon leadership principles, these are different tenets that essentially drive decision making at Amazon, and they care about those a lot. And so they interview according to those as well. And I mention that because it is a way you can prepare. If you know the Amazon leadership principles, it's worthwhile kind of thinking about how your experience lines up with them. And I can get more to that if there's questions around that. But yeah, at that point in time, that is, it kind of describes my transition from academia, working as a grad student and finishing my PhD, into working on Alexa in 2018. So I wanted to essentially give a little bit of an overview about what I do. And so to start off, I thought it would be useful just to kind of give a brief explanation and a graphic on kind of the types of things you could do. So this is, I put voice assistant pipeline here. You can think of it as like a language, the general way in which machines are processing language. So voice assistants are the most common tool that this is done in, but this is done all sorts of places as well. And so a lot of these components exist outside of just things like Alexa or Google, excuse me. But one thing that's unique to voice assistants is going to be what's called a wake word. And this is just the word you say to actually wake the device up, right? And so there are teams of people that work on those components, making sure that it's good at recognizing that. And then once that happens, you have automatic speech recognition, which is essentially just taking the speech that someone produces from their mouth and transcribing it. The machine will transcribe it to text. So it converts speech to text, so that way it can work with that speech. And that is definitely an area where linguists specifically interested in like sound mapping, that kind of thing, spend a lot of time. But once you have the speech, then you've got to understand it, right? So we do that. We do all this just subconsciously, but it takes a lot of work to get a machine to do that. And so natural language understanding is the component that basically converts the transcription and then assesses like goals that are associated with that transcription. So like, what do people actually want when they're saying something? And that is usually given in the form of an interpretation, in which they kind of have a general area in which that goal is going to exist, the specific intent that the user has, and then probably it's going to look at the different entities within that request to map those onto actual real world items. And that is where I spend most of my time. But within that, you have dialogue management, which is thinking about this within the context of an entire dialogue. So that's where it gets even more complicated, and I work with that as well. So not only do we want to understand a specific sentence, but we also want to understand the specific sentence within the general context that the person is speaking in. And so that includes things like the previous dialogue, that the previous utterance that they've spoken, and perhaps what device they're talking to, right? So you can imagine, I don't know if for those of you, I didn't actually bring a graphic, but if you go look up Alexa, there's like literally 30 different things that have Alexa in it. Sorry, I was actually checking because I have an Alexa in my room. I was making sure that it didn't wake up, but I've renamed it, so we're good. Yeah, so you might expect different results depending on which device you're talking to. For instance, we have some that are screened and some that are not screened, right? Where actual will give you visual information versus not. And then the final thing is text to speech, and this is the actual thing that the device will say back to you, right? So if you say, hey, play Imagine Dragons, then it'll say something like, here's Imagine Dragons from Spotify, boom, and then it plays the song. So that text to speech is going to be that piece. But within that as well, you've also just got the actual action that the device is taking. And I put a little trace line around that because I kind of help with that work, but that is definitely more of a result of the work that I do. Where my main focus is in the natural language understanding and ensuring that we have the correct understanding of an utterance, and we've put that in the right place to be successful when we respond to people. So I mentioned that these other places are areas you can work in. Linguists and Alexa actually is a little bit of a complicated thing. If you think about it, within the world of linguistics, you have a lot of different areas you can focus in. And when we think of like Alexa and linguistics, most often we want to think computational linguistics, which deals with things like natural language processing, natural language understanding, probably even machine learning, where you might be taking NLP tactics and trying to train a model on it. Or maybe you're taking natural language processing tactics and you're going to use that to inform maybe rules, and you might actually write grammars. That sort of work is what's done by what are known as language engineers. So they do a lot of work with what are called finite state transducers, and they're essentially like more rule oriented things. Like, hey, when someone says this, we should do this. And they do it based on a very, comprehensive understanding of language. And it's done to ensure that we have the correct outcome for an input utterance, right? When you say something to a device, you want to make sure it's going to do the right thing. So the easiest way to do that is to write a rule-based grammar, which is what language engineers spend a lot of time on. Meaning that a language engineer is going to be oftentimes very content focused. They're going to kind of pick a specific area, like music maybe, and they'll really understand the ins and outs of that and how they need to edit their grammars to make sure that the device is doing a good job of interacting with the customer. They also work with annotation, which I'll get into in a minute. For those of you who haven't heard of annotation, I talk about that because that's something that overlaps between language engineers and what I do. And sometimes they do help train and train and evaluate, and they kind of work very closely with the actual machine learning models, meaning they might be responsible for running a machine learning model training pipeline. And that is different than what we do. So they're closer to the computational aspects of linguistics versus language data researcher, which is actually a little bit of a newer role. And this is what I do. I was talking with Daniel right before, and I would say a good way of thinking about this, if you've heard of the field of data science, which is kind of looking at, you use analytical tools and descriptive analysis, kind of pairing those things to understand what data is telling you. That is closer to what we do. As language data researchers, we dig into the language data, often mostly on aggregate, but kind of understanding what the data is telling us and doing a lot of analysis. So we focus on analysis, and where we interact with machine learning models is usually more on the evaluation side or understanding how to measure things. So we do less of the specific work of writing inputs, though we do generate larger data sets from these types of more analytical perspectives that might be used as inputs. So another difference is we work pretty closely with metrics, which are, is just any sort of way to measure something. Sometimes we help create metrics, and sometimes we help just by choosing the right existing metrics for the evaluation that we need. And then finally, we also work with annotation. And so we work on or design annotation workflows. And I'm going to get to what that is in a sec, because it's a very specific concept. Probably it's not used in it, and it's growing in popularity because it's needed for more and more things. But yeah, I am a language data researcher. Full disclosure, when I started, my job was called language engineer because we've kind of grown and linguistics and technology has become a bigger field. And so they've realized we need two different tracks for how linguists can interact with the tech. And so language data researcher is a bit of a newer field / merger with an older field to kind of give that focus on data science. Cool. So three main buckets of work, I would say, that we do: data collection and creation, data enrichment, which is where we get into annotation, and data analysis. Those are the three big types of tasks that I take on. And this is where I was saying that the methods that I learned in graduate school, and some in undergrad as well, were definitely super helpful to me because they are the way I do all these things, right? And so why I don't study human sentence processing anymore, I definitely use experimental design pretty often, as well as corpus strategies pretty often. And we've even done some fieldwork related strategies, not like literally talking to people, but survey related things. And I'll get into, I actually probably summarized that ahead of time, but one of the big things is getting to data. There's so much tooling, and Amazon does an excellent job of security, ensuring that we have a lot of encryption. And so finding the right tool to access what we're looking for is an important thing. And I say that meaning that it's a useful skill to be able to adapt to new tools and understand what tool goes for what job. That's something that I've had to learn since I've been here because I use so many different things. And so some examples of this are SQL or SQL, which is a querying language because we query databases a lot. And then we work within a couple different data structures. So this is kind of technical, but if you think CSV, this tabular files, that's one data structure, but we also store things in what's called JSON, which is a whole different kind of nested data structure. And so working and interacting between the two of them is actually something that I have to do fairly frequently. And so manipulating data munging is what we call it, is something that we do a lot of. And yeah, this is where corpus comes into play, because we essentially have a big corpora and we're looking for what is useful. And so sampling, identifying what to sample and what to pull out to spit into our models is something that we work on, and or evaluate the performance of our models. And sometimes we want to be able to define the boundaries of the things that we're creating, and we want to use data to do that, right? We want to understand, we want to do that from a data-driven perspective. This is a feature of Amazon that I actually really appreciate, that they like to make their decisions around what they understand from data rather than feelings, if that makes sense. Which intuition is a wonderful thing, and we want to pair those two often. And then sometimes we even generate data. And this could be things like having people write sentences and then automating a sentence creation process from that. So that's a kind of a merger of both automation and manual work to generate new data sets. And then, yeah, employing surveys. This is minor, but we definitely want to use surveys, and we have used surveys to help fill in the gaps of our understanding. So data enrichment. This is what's called annotation, is the main way we do this. And annotation is where a human is going to go through a piece of data and they're going to evaluate it and they're going to make a decision on it. And the actual annotation is going to be an enrichment on top of that data. So one pretty basic idea, you can imagine customer satisfaction. And so one way you could have annotation would be to have someone make decisions on whether somebody was satisfied with the product, and or whether the result was correct, as far as if you think about understanding, whether or not the result of an understanding was correct. But those decisions that the humans make are the annotations, and they're useful for machine learning because it's the oversight. Humans provide the oversight for the models to make sure that they're not spinning off the rails. Oh. Okay. Yeah, so we have humans that evaluated just a tiny little proportion of Alexa turns to help us train and evaluate Alexa systems. And my team is responsible for a lot of the design of this. And so we do things like conventions, which is essentially a set of guidelines around how to make a decision. So we would define each decision that somebody makes, and they would be responsible, the person doing the annotation is responsible for ensuring that they follow those conventions. We also do tooling designs, meaning I've actually helped design the UI of different tools that people use for that annotation. And then we finally are responsible for ensuring that we get the right data. That's kind of the biggest thing, right? If you don't have the right data, then whatever you're doing is useless because it's not going to help anybody. So that's actually the biggest and often hardest problem, is identifying what should we be looking at. And then on the output side, we spend a lot of time evaluating quality, because we want to ensure that what we produce is high quality. And so one of the biggest things, if you're familiar with this world, is called inter-annotator agreement. And this refers to metrics which assess which assess whether or not two people agree on the same decision. So if we ask two people to evaluate the same thing and they have a disagreement, that's useful to know, because then we want to understand why there was a disagreement and suss that out and make our process better for higher quality data. Then the final thing is data analysis. So we do a lot of descriptive analysis, understanding what we currently do. So this helps us evaluate the performance of Alexa. And this will be, using basically querying for large sets of, lots of aggregated data, and then understanding, generally speaking, in what direction we see Alexa, maybe making bad responses or good responses, that kind of thing. And then we also do this to help define product boundaries. So if we know we're going to be adding a new feature to, let's say, the music, then one thing we might want to do is, based on what the general specs of that feature are, is understand what type of data we might be hitting with it, if that makes sense. I know I'm speaking very generally, and the reason for that is I am erring on the side of ensuring that I'm not breaching any sort of Amazon privacy restrictions. Unfortunately, I can't talk about specific things I do oftentimes. Yeah, and then we do statistical analysis, and we do this at two levels. Like I said, we evaluate our annotation workflows, so that means running stats over the results that we get. And this is in the form of things like, basic agreement method, agreement percentage, or there's a metric called the kappa that we calculate. And those are just some of the things we do. We also then evaluate model outputs. So like part of the annotation is used to then evaluate whether our models are performing well or not. Because like I said, we don't want our models to spin off the rails and do things that we're not wanting them to do. And so we are responsible for ensuring that we have things harnessed exactly like we want them to. And so then I wanted to list some of the tools that I use and have learned. I will say when I came into this job, I have worked in R, which you see listed there. I had not done anything else. So I'd never done a SQL query. I'd never done a Python script. So that includes Jupyter, which is a Python environment. And I never used Pandas, which is a Python package that does data science like R does. So these things are very possible to learn on the job, but hard, I will say. That took a lot of work to do, and it still takes a lot of work to do. So learning the tooling, some of the general tools ahead of time is very, very helpful. But these are the types of things I do to make the analyses happen. Recently, I've been spending a lot of time in Jupyter notebooks because I'm essentially taking data sets and I need to, what do I need to do? I need to shape them in the way that I need them to be. And then usually I'm going to be producing some like output metrics and some visualizations. So that means like some basic graphs of bar graphs and things like that, as well as the table which shows, hey, here's what the data looks like. And then on top of that, I will help with some bulleted explanations on how to interpret that. So that's a very general way of thinking about the kind of analysis that I do. So what skills have I taken with me? Like I said, lots of methods related skills. So experimental design has been very useful for a lot of different studies that we do. My team in particular has run experiments, and we do run experiments. We've done survey development. I've helped build a survey for people. A long time ago, one of the things I worked on was incorporating, for those of you who have maybe used Alexa, you might have heard Alexa suggest like skills, but Alexa allows third-party developers. In fact, you guys could build an Alexa skill if you wanted to. That's a very possible thing. They have a skills kit for anybody to build a skill. But we want to integrate those well with the Alexa system. And so that's something I've worked on before. And so one of the things we've done to do that is do a survey to assess skill usage, things like that. Just general ways people might want to use like a smart home skill. So that's one of the things that I worked on. And then corpus strategies. So this is like data sampling techniques, basically, is what I would mostly think about. Yeah, so basically data sampling techniques. We don't use tagged corpuses, which is just something that we don't do. And so we're not looking for things like nouns, but rather we're looking for other types of things, usually like an intent. What is something as an intent? I do use linguistic theory, specifically related to meaning, which is interesting because my training in more formal linguistics was mostly in syntax. I started as a theoretical syntactician when I was in grad school. I think Kristen was there when I made the switch from theoretical syntax to psycholinguistics in sentence processing. And I basically was like, thinking about sentences is great, but I want to like test them too. And so that's what was essentially and actually I should say theoretical syntacticians do test them. It's just a different process through which they do that. So I wanted to run experiments. And so I don't use my syntax near as much, but I do use a ton of meaning. Our team actually just presented at the LSA some of the work that we did on Grice's maxims. So that's pragmatics, right? And theories of the theory of how people use conversational strategies. And we were looking at similar types of things, like except how do these things work when you're talking to a computer? Do you employ the same conversational strategies, and do you do the same general idea? Does that framework hold when you're talking to computers? And we came up with kind of a crazy notion that we should have another maxim, maybe. Basically, you have to account for the fact that people take priority over the machine. That just generally tends to be the case. So in some form or fashion, we need to account for that. And then the technical skills that I developed in my grad program, like basically in R, I use a lot. So those are the main skills. I think that's all I have listed. Yeah, so I think that's all. Those are the main skills I've used. I mean, there's more. There's other skills, but those are like the big sets of skills that I learned mostly in grad school for myself. But obviously lots of undergrad programs would teach those same things, and that I've taken with me. So then, sweet, right on track. The last slide I have here is just my thoughts on some general things you might, as a someone interested in language technology, look into ahead of time. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are things that I've just thought about. Hey, these would have been useful for me had I known this when I was trying to get a job at Amazon. And the first is related to technical skills for accessing and analyzing language data. There's a lot of public corpora out there, a lot of big data sets out there. You know, I see what's out there and figure out how to get access to it and like mess around with big data sets. That would be a great start. So I recently was talking to somebody who's, I think there's one called BERT, which I don't actually know what that stands for. But I'm sure either Dr. Fleckenstein or Daniel, or I'm sure they would be able to point you to some general public corpora you could access. But that's one thing that might be useful to develop. Another thing is, if you're interested in language technology at Amazon, you know, machine learning is employed a lot. And so this is the concept, right, for those maybe that aren't as familiar, but machine learning is like what we think about when we, what it is. I don't know how I was supposed to say that, but it's what AI is. Right, so when you think artificial intelligence, machine learning is what enables the artificial intelligence. And usually this is going to be employed through taking a model and training it on a data set that is supposed to look like the actual data that it will be processing. Then once it's been trained on that data set, it will then go, it will learn based on the inputs, because you tell it what's right and what's wrong. And then it is able to then take new data that looks like the data you trained it on and predict the correct output. So that's generally speaking what a model is trying to do, but there's an entire life cycle we have to it. And you know, it's a very big world. And so I would say be a little careful, but having an understanding of the basic machine learning life cycle would be very useful. And then skills in like project design or experimental design. We do a lot of studies is the way I would frame the phrase we use, I think, which is essentially like a mini project, right? There's a question that gets asked and we need to figure out how do we answer that question. So in that you have either an experiment or maybe a set of data analyses that you're going to be running, which is just a small project, but you want to design it appropriately to correctly answer the question that you're getting. So I'm trying to think of an example on the fly, but within language, you know, you might think about like, if you think about within pragmatics, like, you know, if Bob asked Joe a question, how do you know if Joe is frustrated or not? So there's your question that you start with. And then you think about, given, you know, we haven't outlined what data we have, but you think about what kind of data would you need to answer that question? How do you get that data? Those are the types of things that we do as language data researchers when we're given questions, you know, something like that are related to language. So those are the main ones that I've put here. Trying to think if there's anything else I'd add to it on the spot, but I think those, and I would say if you're interested in language technology, do understand language theory. I do use specifically meaning related linguistic theory very, very frequently. And for those that are interested in more of maybe the sound related things, phonotactics, which is like the notion of how languages put sounds together to make words. So like there's rules, if you add a new word to English, there's rules on how those sounds are going to combine, right? You can't, I mean, if you think about the difference between like Russian and English, any old Russian word doesn't really make a good English word because a lot of times there's way too many consonants stuck next to each other for an English word to be good. And that's what's called phonotactics, right? You don't want to stick 5 consonants in a string and then have one vowel there at the end. English doesn't like that very much. And so if you're interested in working with like automatic speech recognition and more of the sound related language technologies, those types, that world of theory, understanding how languages work would be very useful and is very useful, but it's not where I work. So it's a kind of separate world. Another thing, like a lot of people ask me about dialects. I don't do anything related to dialects, but that would be something in automatic speech recognition where you're trying to assess the differences in different dialects. So cool. Well, I'll stop talking here. Be glad to answer lots of questions. So yeah.
All right, thanks, Nate. So just feel free to, if you have a question, just go ahead and shout it out. Don't worry about being recognized in any way. Also, if you're not able to use your mic for some reason, feel free to use the chat. So yeah, anyone have any questions?
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the people asking the questions.
I actually kind of have a question about the last point you made about the dialects, because I know Alexa has had issues in the past with accents and things like that. And I know you said you don't work with it as much, but what are people doing to kind of reconcile that issue?
Honestly, I don't have a direct, like, my default is I don't know.
Okay, that's
But I mean, it would be, if you're looking, the way you would solve that problem is probably adjusting your training data, right? To incorporate training data from accents that probably vary enough from whatever English that it is being trained on, that Alexa would get better at it. I think, like, I've seen YouTube videos about like Scottish, how Alexa can't understand a Scottish accent at all. So things like that would be maybe finding enough data that would then allow that to be recognized. It's hard to do because then you have to balance that against an accent that is completely different from Scottish, and so it's a tricky balancing problem.
But I got a follow-up question to that, Nate. That raises the question of who makes the decisions about the reference data that Alexa and other AI is being trained on. Are decisions to put language variation into the system, are those things being done or not?
Yeah, definitely. And we want to, like I said, there's data informed decisions there. And so I think those are, as far as who's making those decisions, again, I don't know, but that's definitely something that is being considered. And the perspective is you want a device that is diverse and able to account for the language diversity that we see. So it's just, I think another thing that we don't consider is the fact that we process language irregularity like it's nothing. But any form of irregularity that you put within a device, if you think about, any sort of computer, is going to cause problems at the very even smallest level. And so that's what makes this problem so tricky, is it's oftentimes that kind of data that is causing the problem. And it's no one's fault. It just, our brains are really good at processing language. That's what it boils down to. Cool. Any other questions?
I'm sorry to ask another question, but this is more focused on you rather than Alexa. But did you know you wanted to go into linguistics in your higher education when you were studying Spanish, or was that kind of something you realized?
Great question. When I started college, no. The reason I actually majored in Spanish was when I figured out that I wanted to do linguistics. But UTA at the time did not have a linguistics major. And so what I did was took a linguistics minor and did an undergrad in Spanish, because they also allowed you to kind of do almost a minor there as well. I took a ton of Spanish linguistics courses and then quickly transitioned to linguistics for my graduate degree. But I also actually almost majored in psychology. So I guess it's funny, I essentially studied the merger of the two fields that I was interested in. But yeah, no, I figured that out probably my second year of college. So.
Nate, I have a question for you. What do you see sort of the growth of the field, like in terms of work in AI, work with, Amazon and all of its competitors? I don't want to say it since your Alexa, not named Alexa, will hear us and report it. But I sort of like the big three that are, or maybe four now, with Facebook getting in there and trying to have some stuff, and Apple and Google and Amazon, everybody, it seems to be growing exponentially. Is that true? I mean, is it like, do you see the next 10 years this growth just
Oh
keeping
yeah,
at this accelerating rate? Like this is a hot job field, no doubt, right?
yeah, it is. It's growing a lot, and I think there's a lot of new jobs that are being developed within this, because I think if we think more generally like a language technology, meaning the ability for technology to parse and produce language, that is growing in all sorts of areas that we don't even really even realize. I think voice assistants are the most marketable way that they're growing, but there's more and more and more and more companies that are employing language technology. I mean, Google was doing this so much long before all of us, because if you think about their search engine, that's, you had to parse language for search, right? And so even, companies like if you get an automated phone, our favorite thing is when you're in an automated phone recording. I mean, if they don't have keypad entries, they're doing some sort of, NLP or some version of language processing, right? And so, yeah, I think this field is going to do nothing but grow. And the types of jobs that you'll see are going to continue to expand as well as the domains continue to expand, right? So it's not just, yeah. So that the type of content that you're going to be input is going to expand too. So you're going to see new jobs open up there.
What's it like to just as a follow-up, what can you tell our students what it's like to like work there? Like what's the work environment like? Like do you in a non-COVID era, do you get to work at home, or do you get to go to like a really cool building and work? Because we see all of us over here in the Southeast, we see like, we're like, wow, let's see what they're doing. Like they're going to these really great places. Like they're taking their dog to work. I'm a professor. I can't take my dog to work. I want to, but so
Yeah.
can you tell us just what does it look like? I guess tell us what it looks like right now, and tell us like what it would look like, what it looked like 2 years ago, or what you think it will hopefully look like in the next year again.
Yeah. So now we all work from home. If you're in Amazon tech, you're going to be working from home because we can. So there's no reason to have people going. The buildings are, I guess, open, but everybody works from home, and that's what the recommendation is to do. Yeah. So beforehand, we definitely all had desks. We do bring our dogs to work. So I have 2 coworkers that do that. And so I definitely sat next to dogs some days when I'm working, which is fine by me. And as far as like the buildings, like the environment that we work in, I mean, it's not, so I work in, if anybody's ever been to Seattle, the old Macy's building, which is about 2 blocks north from, or 3 blocks north from the Pike Place Market. It's kind of a famous market in downtown Seattle. I work 3 blocks away from that in the old Macy's building that Amazon bought the floors above it and converted that to an office space. And it's great. I mean, I will say the one thing I had to get used to is like all the walls are whiteboards, literally. So like because there's always people just writing down diagrams of something or other. So that's a big thing. Yeah, and there's my team, I was telling Daniel this, my team does a lot of collaboration. So because we sit in the middle of, a lot of different teams, because we're talking to like folks that report on metrics. We're also talking to the scientists. We are in a lot of meetings. And so it often means for us before COVID that we were doing meetings in person a lot. Now I'm on the computer doing them. And my hope would be that we have some version of in-person going back. I think that's just a big question mark, right? I think a lot of companies are figuring that out right now.
Nate, let me ask a related question just in terms of jobs here. So, I mean, a lot of what you're talking about seems like a job that you would need a PhD in linguistics or something like that in, and we're here in an English department. So I'm just asking, what sort of jobs do you see for people with a humanities bachelor's degree? Is Amazon employing these people? And what would that sort of look like?
It's a great question. Yeah, so the 2 main jobs that I did talk about, language engineer and language data researcher, if you're kind of coming in cold, you probably need at least a master's. Unfortunately, that's like the level of experience. There are other paths for that as well. I think you can do this without a master's, but I think for those 2 jobs, that's true. So there's a couple things I would say. The first is for those that are in undergrad that are working on that, if you have the skill set that you're interested in this kind of work, applying for internships is definitely an option. We've actually had an undergraduate intern in our team before. And so those skills that I kind of mentioned are definitely strong necessities. And so being able to demonstrate those would be part of the need. But so that's one option of, starting an internship there, and you can then, that is a path to a position. But there's also other roles, like you were saying, outside of those two, and those would be options. So one is, I think in Amazon, we call it like a data linguist. And these are people that are probably going to be experts in, oftentimes they're language experts too. So we use data linguists for different types of languages as well. And they'll be doing some of the same types of tasks, but maybe at a smaller scale, like analytical tasks, qualitative deep dives, things like that. And then you can, so yeah, I would say that's the big other one that I know of. But related to what I do, you also have things like related to user experience research and user experience design. And this is it's related in that it's a human oriented field. So it may not be necessarily English, but you're looking at, sociology, that kind of anthropology, those types of areas. And there's going to be jobs related to that. Some of them will require graduate degrees, but there are going to be similar types of entry-level positions with a bachelor's degree.
Awesome. Thanks, Nate. Any other questions? I've also got some questions here in the chat that were asked earlier that I'll go to. But if anyone has a question they want to say while I'm looking. So someone asked a question early on, and this relates to Alexa and her voice. So I'll read the question as it was asked. Sage asked, how do you feel as a linguist about AI like Alexa and Siri having female assigned voices? Is there a reason, science behind that from your perspective or background, or, so why is that, Nate? I've never thought about it till Sage asked that question. Why do all of these voice assistants have female voices?
I honestly don't I don't know. I was not a part of any of the research going into that. So I just have to say I don't know to that one. Sorry. I'm betting there is research behind it, but I can't speak anything to it.
Follow-up question. This is just for me. Is there an Alexa out there? Is this based on a human's actual phonology, or is this all computer generated from models of several different people?
Good question. I also don't know the answer to that one. Based on the way it sounds, yes, there is a human out there. Is what my guess would be, but I will also say I don't know the answer to that one. So.
Hey, I have the answer as the phonetician. I have the answer for the voice thing, I think, which is people have, especially people with hearing problems, have really hard times hearing really low formant values of men with low pitches. At the same time, they have really trouble with really high pitches of females. So Alexa is sort of like this, if you think about it in musical terms, it's like an alto woman's voice, which is really that sweet spot of no TH sound is too high or no E is too high where you can't hear it, or no ooh or O is so low that, if you, I learned
basically that. It sounds like I wouldn't
PhD acoustics. Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, I think that's it. I mean, I think they do a really good job of pitching it literally pitching it out of a quality that most people can.
That makes sense. I don't know the answer to that. I literally just have no idea.
But that's so cool that you don't worry about that part. That's not your part. That's somebody else who went to school for that, some dorky person who cares about the stuff I care about, right? But you and Kristen care about discoursey stuff and meaning and all of that. And I'm I like sounds. And Daniel's I like grammar, and that's okay.
Exactly.
And you have all those cool walls that you can write on.
We do.
Awesome. And let me ask another question that was asked in the chat, and I feel like probably a lot of us might have it. So someone asked, where does the majority of the data you analyze come from? Some of that you answered, but also you've thrown around the word data a lot, probably more than our English majors are used to hearing in their in any of their classes. So when you say data, what do you mean, and where do you get this data from?
Most of it is very anonymized data that we're looking at, like things like how many times that an intent was invoked. Meaning you're like, hey, I want to play something. So that kind of thing. That's the majority of the data that we look at. It comes from Alexa utterances. And so, as I said, a very, very small percentage is annotated by humans. And so, yeah, that's what I refer to. But alongside that, we also have data that comes from outside third-party developers, as well as data that we create ourselves. So it's all language data or language-oriented data. So.
Awesome. And yeah, so that makes sense. So what you're dealing with is the people are asking Alexa stuff and you're trying to make Alexa better, right? So that's the data that your projects are working on. And like, so someone else had a different set of data for actually building Alexa then, right?
Yeah, that's so I use the term, I think, bootstrap in my presentation. And the notion of bootstrapping is building the first iteration of it. How do you get from no data to a model? And that is a problem that is solved in a variety of ways. In some cases, surveys help us there, right? If we're just interested in understanding, hey, how would people say something? We can survey that. And so I think that is a way that happens. But yeah, we deal with features that currently exist.
May I ask a question? This is Triply, Nate. Your presentation was fantastic, and I hope our students are just soaking it all in. So thank you again for being here and talking with us all. I have a couple questions in the chat, which we may or may not get to, and that's totally fine. But one of the things that I'm thinking of, not as a linguist, and I imagine several of the students who are at this presentation are not linguists. How can people who are not linguists apply some of the skills that they might have picked up on, either as language users or as consumers of Alexa-like products, or just have other skills that they develop as English majors? How can they adapt to the kind of work environment you're in?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I would say that's a great question. The uniqueness, I guess, of the position that I am in is the linguistic perspective. But things like data analysis skills, understanding how the machine learning life cycle, and maybe more generally, so those are the first two things I think about. And I think those you can adapt regardless of whether or not you're a linguist. You can do data analysis on language data. You may not be able to do it in the same way that a linguist will, but you definitely can. And I think that there's a lot of people who do just that. So that's the first thing I would say. And then thinking about, yeah. So I guess that's the main way. I'm trying to think of another, just thinking more broadly.
May I also, in the meanwhile, ask you like a totally petty question? What would you say is the best part of being involved in a project like this? And not like the philosophical stuff, but like, what's the fun stuff that you could tell our students about?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. It probably varies person by person, but I think just oftentimes the analyses that we do are fun. You kind of figure out stuff. It's fun to answer questions. So I'm a problem-oriented person, meaning if I'm given a problem, I want to solve it. And usually it's a question and then I need to answer it. And so I find that to be a lot of fun. meaning that if I have a data set and I'm just going to be figuring out how to shape it and what to visualize, and that's just a fun thing to spend a day doing for me. I think another thing that's fun is to think about how to design things. So specifically, I think about annotation workflows. You know, when you're thinking about how do I get a person, how do you get somebody to make a decision the way you want them to make a decision? So there's a little bit of a teaching element to that. So I think that's the other thing that I find to be a lot of fun. So yeah, those are the two things that I would say. That does bring up another element, like training. Training is something that we do. So people who are good at teaching, you know, collecting new information and repackaging it for a good purpose. That is something I work with people who do that. People that maybe don't write the design of the conventions that I do, but yet ensure that they're standardized and formatted in a way that's readable for people. I think that's very English related. I actually worked with a couple different English majors throughout my career here at Amazon who helped me with that. So I'm glad you asked that question, because it brought up a couple of
I'm so glad you brought up analysis, and I'm so glad you brought up these particular aspects, especially in training, because those would be some things that can be plan A for our students who otherwise might be thinking, oh, I have to be a teacher because that's all I can do. So I think this is really very useful. Thank you.
I actually think part of the reason I was able to originally get the job was we needed teaching-oriented people when I first started. And so that was a more natural skill that I had. So those jobs that if you are a teaching-oriented person, there are definitely positions within big, you know, industry technology companies to take these informations, this type of information, and package it in a way that we're able to train people up in that.
All right, Nate. We only have a couple of minutes left. I did want to, once again, publicly thank you for sharing your time. I know Amazon probably keeps you super busy, so we're very thankful that you took some time to share with us. And to the students out there that are interested in doing something like what Nate has talked about, some next steps that you might want to take. Take a linguistics class with me or Dr. Childs, Dr. Fleckenstein that are here, interested in this sort of stuff. Also, the digital culture and design major that's part, or you can get a minor in that as well in English here. If you're listening to Nate and you're at home wanting to do the exact same thing and, teach Alexa how to hear things better, maybe start to think about taking some of those DCD classes and moving forward in that way. I do want to ask one final question that I'm sure we're all thinking about, because we've seen The Matrix and we've seen Blade Runner and stuff. So Nate, what are the safeguards involved to keep Alexa from taking over the world? That's what we really all want to know.
Smart decision making on us. I don't think we have to worry about that, is what I would say. As I said, the inability for computers to process irregularity within language, they're still very much reliant on the training and oversight of human beings to do things. Yeah, it's funny you ask, because when I first started working at Amazon, a buddy asked me if I was going to build Skynet. So I said, no, I'm just teaching it how to talk.
All right. Well, you're the first step. Okay. So we can blame Nate later for teaching Alexa how to understand these problems. I don't know how far in the future it is before she takes over, but here's the guy, right, that we can thank for this. So once again, we'll be conscious of everyone's time and cut it off here. I'm sure that there may be much more questions. If you do have questions, please feel free to email me or Dr. Fleckenstein or Dr. Childs, and we'll be able, hopefully, to reach out to Nate if there are any questions or if anyone has anything further. they're thinking about, you know, a line of work like this. If Nate's willing, we can send you an email question in the future for anything that exists like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Nate. And thanks to all y'all for coming out. I do want to quickly plug that our next English Future Speaker Series, I got to look to see the date. The next in this series, give me a second, bring up my phone, is going to be on March 18th. And we're having, the speaker is Dr. Darla Domke DeMonte, who is an associate dean, I believe, or associate provost. Forget what her title is. Tripti, what's his title?
She's Associate Provost of Global Initiatives and a professor of strategic management.
Yes, I can never remember if it's dean or provost. Yeah, associate provost. And so she'll be speaking with us about her job and also jobs in the field that she's, you know, interested in, things like Fulbrights and global stuff like that. So come out to that. That's again on March 18th, also at 5 p.m., also on Zoom. We'll be, Miss Joan will send out a flyer and the link, just like we did for this talk. So thanks again to our speaker, and thanks to all of y'all for coming. I'm going to cut us off here. Look for an email with a link to the YouTube video of this coming out in the future. Thanks, Nate.
Thank y'all. Thanks for having me.